Views expressed are not endorsed by the United States Department of Defense or its components.
Welcome back to the Flyover Podcast as part of USAFA Aviation. Today, for episode 21, we have with us Lieutenant Colonel Przemek Strekowski. Lieutenant Colonel Strekowski is the Air Officer Commanding of Cadet Squadron 6 at the United States Air Force Academy, Colorado Springs, Colorado. He is a native of Hacienda Heights, California, by way of Poland, and received his commission through the United States Air Force Academy in 2009. Upon graduation, he attended undergraduate pilot training at Laughlin Air Force Base, Texas, followed by specialized helicopter training at Fort Rucker, Alabama. Following pilot training, Lieutenant Colonel Strekowski was assigned to the 41st RQS Moody Air Force Base, Georgia, where he served as a HH-60G instructor pilot.
His second assignment was as an exchange pilot with the United States Navy, where he graduated from the United States Navy Weapons School, NAS Falcon, Nevada, and served as the Helicopter C Combat Weapons School Tactics and Training Officer. Prior to his current position, Lieutenant Colonel Strekowski was the Acting Director of Operations, 66th Rescue Squadron, Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada. Lieutenant Colonel Strekowski has deployed 6 times in various combat theaters around the globe, most recently supporting evacuation operations out of Hamid Karazi International Airport, Kabul, Afghanistan, in the summer of 2021. He's an evaluator pilot with over 1,900 flight hours in various aircraft, including the HH-60G Pavehawk, MH-60S Seahawk, and T-53.
Well, sir, thank you for coming on. We're really excited to have you.
Thanks for having me. Yep.
I'm a cadet in Cadet Squadron 6, so it's really cool to have you here.
Thank you.
And so we'll just jump right into your flying career.
Okay.
So first question we have for you is, what's the process like for becoming a helicopter pilot compared to a fixed-wing pilot?
So the process has changed now. I used to go through a very similar process as the fixed-wing kind of pathway where we went T6s and then we would track off from T6s to helicopters. Now you have to choose to be a helicopter pilot as a cadet. In a lot of ways, that's unfortunate to have to choose that early. But so now the way the process works is you get a pilot slot here, and then you board for helicopters like you would for NJEP or something like that. And then if you get picked up for UHT, what we call undergraduate helicopter training, then you go to an IFT-like program that we have for helos. We call it IFTR, and you fly the Bell Ranger, I believe. Right now it's in Texas with a civilian company, should be moving to Alabama. But you go through initial flight training there, and then you go to Fort Novacell. They changed the name. It used to be Fort Rucker. Now it's Fort Novacell in Alabama. And that pathway looks very similar like any other pilot training. Start with the basics, academics, sims, and then you move on to instruments, tactical training, things like that. And then at the end of your UHT time flying the Huey, then you track off to either the 60 Huey and Augusta Westland 139 once the Grey Wolf comes online, or Osprey. And then from Fort Novacell, you go to Albuquerque right now where you do your follow-on training for one of those platforms, and then you go to your operational unit.
And so when we talk about the HH-60, the Pavehawk, we talk a lot about combat, search and rescue. And so when you evaluate a pilot in the HH-60, what are some big things you're looking for to be able to say, yes, this person is like ready to go do combat search and rescue?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's a little bit different between evaluations and instructing, right? So for evals, it's very basic level. There's a couple things that you have to do that you cannot do or you fail. Where we do a lot of our let's say grooming and determining whether somebody should be in combat, that's all on the instructor side, right? So go through various upgrades, things like that. But what we look for most is the adaptability. CSAR is probably one of the most dynamic mission sets that we have. You change one little thing in a scenario or a situation, the entire mission changes, your approach changes. So when we instruct and develop our air crew through like the various syllabi that we have, what we look for a lot is adaptability, right? So we'll throw various things at them, we'll change the plan on the fly and see how they deal with it. One of the things that, as I was going through upgrade training, especially for the flight lead piece, that I was taught was it's your job to know everybody else's job. And the reason why is because CSAR is such a unique and niche mission set. Not a lot of other career fields know that much about it. So when we do rescue missions, we do it with the support of other communities. And we have to often tell them, hey, this is what we need. So I need to know the capabilities, limitations of all these other career fields in order to be able to use them in a rescue mission. So we spend a lot of time making sure our guys and gals know, hey, here's the capability of a Strike Eagle. Here's the capability of a Buff, so on and so forth. And then we test that in upgrade training.
And so when you talked about like instructing there, talking about like, is this person fit to go into combat? So what does that look like? Like, what's the washout rate? Can people get redlined, or how does that all work?
Yeah, that's a great question. The washout rate is not super high because we have a lot of ways to train, let's say, poor performance out of people just through reps. What you'll see a lot of is vastly different rates of upgrade in the community. You'll see folks that will blaze through the upgrade just because their skill sets are really high, and they have the aptitude for it. And then you'll see folks who'll go 2 tours, not being an instructor pilot, maybe even longer. But we very seldom wash people out because we can train that into people.
And so that sounds really variable of like what you're training for and then kind of where everybody else is, especially going on deployments. So what does the day-to-day look like on deployment considering that variability?
This is probably one of my favorite parts of being in rescue is that every deployment looks different, and it kind of falls in line with the dynamics of the mission set itself. The deployments will also look different. I've had deployments where I've been at a 4-star resort and then bus to a partner nation or coalition nation base and operated out of there. And then I've slept under helicopters and in hammocks strung across the cabin of a helicopter listening to a radio as an op goes down to see if somebody needs this, right? So, and then everything in between. So it's really hard to like pinpoint, hey, what's the day-to-day like? But generally speaking, we are on alert 24/7. So what that means is there'll be usually 2 formations, and then there'll be an on-shift, off-shift kind of flow, okay? So the higher the ops tempo is, the shorter the on-shift window is. There's no shorter than 12 hours. So what it looks like is you'll be on for 12 hours, off for 12 hours, and you'll just flip-flop between the 2 formations. When you're on shift, it's like any other thing. You get in there, the first thing you get is the intel update brief. Hey, what's going on in the theater? What did the last crews do? Threat level changes, things like that. And then we'll shift our gear because we pre-position our gear onto the helos so we can get to the helicopters as quickly as possible and take off. And then we go back to our compound and guys are playing video games, throwing the football around, watching movies, studying, planning for the next mission. All those things happen on shift. And the off shift folks, they're sleeping, eating, working out, but it looks very, very different depending on the deployment that you're on.
And so I don't know what detail you can go into, but talking about like sleeping in hammocks that are stretched across in the middle of probably a forest, or I assume, what's the story behind that? Where were you at, or what were you supporting?
I can talk a little bit about that. So this was in 2016. We were in Bagram at the time. We flew down to Kandahar, and then from Kandahar we forward deployed to. It used to be a FOB. They had torn down a lot of the walls, so it was literally just 4 walls in the middle of the desert. And we were pre-positioned because soft teams, so it was ODA teams with partner nation Afghan SOF. They were doing how far can I go into this? They were doing a hit on a terrorist location, right? It was right on the Pakistan border. And our role was daytime. We were covering down on that op. So there was HH-60Gs going out. There was obviously soft elements. There was the 160th there, F-16s, things like that. So we were sitting alert for those folks. But there was nothing there. It was just 4 walls. So we would fly there in the morning, and then we just wait for 12 hours at a time. Hammocks in the back of the cabin on our SATCOM radio, listening to the ops go down, and then we're just waiting for that magic call scramble, and then we would launch. So,
Awesome.
Yeah.
And so you also participated in the evacuation out of Kabul, Afghanistan. What can you speak to that?
Yeah, so that was it started like any other deployment. We were there for personnel recovery. We were there for the soft aircraft that were doing the evacuations, the ODA teams. We were there for the fixed wing assets that were covering the evac, things like that. So if somebody got in trouble, we were there just to pick them up. So that's how it started. It obviously, just watching the news, it quickly devolved and unraveled. So initially, we were training, doing like the things that we normally do on deployment, and then very quickly, because of the threat level, we weren't able to do anything. We were basically just told to sit there, plan, and wait. And what that looked like for us is folks were going so long between flying that people's currencies were lapsing. So we had to get waivers to even be legal to fly. And the one thing I love about rescue and the personnel in rescue is that we'll do whatever it takes, whatever's asked of us. So even though we weren't able to fly like we wanted to, we did what we could to help out. So a lot of our folks, through various interactions and their backgrounds, knew of people back stateside who wanted to get specific families out of Afghanistan, and they were texting our folks directly, and they were saying, hey, can you get so-and-so out through the gate? So they were in their off time, so we were on shift, off shift like normal, but in their off time, they weren't going to bed, they were going to the gates and trying to locate individual families and pulling them basically through the gate and then through the PAX terminal and then out. So a lot of our folks were actually doing that on their off time for days on end. And the bombing at Abbey Gate, which people are familiar with, we actually had 6 or 7 personnel at that gate a few hours before that bomb went off. And we had made a decision based off of threat reporting that we were going to pull those folks back from the gate because of the threats that were coming through various intel channels. And they missed it by a couple hours, right? So that's what we were doing for a lot of the time. And also, Admiral Vaisley was the US 4A commander, so U.S. Forces Afghanistan commander. He's a 2-star admiral, former SEAL. His staff and him sat 10 feet in our operations center from where our folks were running rescue ops. So I had a direct line to Admiral Vaisley, and as soon as we realized the extent of how many cargo aircraft and airlift were going to be coming into Hamid Karzai, there were no pilots around. So Admiral Vaisley's only air crew were the 60 folks and the 130 folks that were there for rescue. So he looked at us and was like, you guys are my air cell. You guys are going to be running all the air ops in and out of Afghanistan. I'm like, what does a helo guy or a 130 person know about running cargo airlift in and out of the airfield? But in true rescue fashion, our guys were like, yep, we got it, and we'll figure it out. So we already had all of our comm suite stuff set up just because we need that for rescue. So SATCOM, line of sight stuff, all set up. And we just tweaked our frequencies to talk to incoming C-17s, 130s, A-400s, whatever was coming in. And I was 24/7, we manned this thing. So aircraft would come in, we'd call them up, and because we're tracking them on all of our feeds, we'd call them up and just plain English ask them, what's in the back of your aircraft? You know, I have this equipment. I look over to Admiral Vaisley's staff, it's like, do you want this here? And if they said no, I'd turn them around. If they wanted it, like, yep, you're good to come in and land. They'd switch over to the JTACs that were there for the terminal control, and they'd land them. And we were doing this for like 4 days, 24/7, in addition to being on alert for rescue, in addition to having folks out at the gates pulling people through, civilians through the PAX terminal. And that's what that deployment looked like. And I had concerns as the commander there, because I was in command of the 66th Expeditionary Rescue Squadron there at Hamid Karzai. I had a lot of concerns about, are my guys still able to execute rescue missions? they're running 24/7, doing all these other things, nothing related to rescue. Are they going to be able to execute a mission if it came down? Well, that question was answered when that bombing went off, because we got tapped to fly literally across the airfield and try to pick folks up. And we had about a quarter-mile run from our ops center to where our helicopters were, and our guys had to run in full gear. So all the battle rattle weapons, all those things. And 8 minutes after we got called to go, our folks were ready to launch. So that's about as fast as you can possibly do that, especially running that distance. So I was super proud of my guys for being able to do that amidst all the other things that we were doing. So
it's really impressive.
Yeah, and so to kind of talk about a little bit more about that Afghanistan withdrawal and the deterioration of the conditions on the ground, especially around the airport, right? So, I mean, right, images come to mind, right? The C-17, I believe it was, with people crowding it and people tragically holding on and then falling off. So behind the scenes, with you being the rescue element and kind of being what you kind of deemed it like the air component, like kind of controller, air cell. I don't know, just talk me through what happened from your perspective and how the situation was resolved to be able to still have ops.
Yeah, so it's kind of a loaded question because there's a lot of things going on at the same time. But the way it kind of unfolded is, we saw the writing on the wall as provinces in Afghanistan were falling, starting obviously external to the country, or the fringes of the country, I should say, and then moving closer and closer to Kabul. And once it collapsed to Kabul, we were like, this is it. So we had very limited security at the time for the airfield, because I don't think anybody fully understood how quickly this was going to devolve. But that first night, I think the civilian population realized we were evacuating and the time was short, and they got right up to the gates. We didn't have enough security to prevent them from getting onto the airfield. And then when they overran the airfield, I mean, there was no way to land C-17s. There was no way to run any ops because they were all over the airfield. So initially, our main concern was pushing back the civilian population to the perimeter of the airfield so that we can run C-17s through and all these cargo aircraft to evacuate people. So once that occurred, which a lot of that was due to field graders, CGOs, like company grade officers, and enlisted that were the leaders at that level that made that happen. So it was Admiral Vasey saying, hey, I need the airfield back. And you had very specific people, I'm not going to name names because a lot of that is, there's Delta Force there and folks like that, right, that took charge of the situation and were able to push back the civilian population. PJs were involved in that from the rescue element. So once that happened, we started rotating the cargo aircraft through. A lot of what we were bringing into Hamid Karzai were what I call shooters, basically security personnel. So you had a lot of soft elements coming in, folks like that, just to secure the perimeter. And then because of that, we were running short on things like water and food because the DFAC was closed. So a lot of my concern was, can I even feed my folks? And there was a lot of abandoned compounds that were no longer manned at Hamid Karzai. So I had my folks going through random compounds and saying, hey, is there MREs we can find? And we ended up finding a whole a Connex full of 1,000 MREs. And I was like, get those. So they all wily staff sergeants are just grabbing all this stuff and whatever they can get. But it was a giant mess because it's things that I didn't prepare myself mentally to be doing. And the type of leadership I was engaging wasn't, hey, how do you execute this rescue mission? Is how do I feed 179 personnel? How do I, ensure that our folks have places to sleep? You know what I mean? So it was eye-opening and a much different experience than I thought I would have prior to going to Afghanistan.
And so was that your last deployment?
That was my very last deployment, my first deployment as a commander.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so for the past 5 deployments, were they more along the rescue stuff, or were you ever asked to kind of flex in different ways?
It was very, what I would call benign, right? Very rescue based. Everything was preset. We were replacing our own rescue elements from maybe other bases, but it was all already set up. So it's just a matter of, it's plug and play, right? We replaced the 41st with the 66. Everything's already set up. You just you just input a different unit there and everything was set.
And so kind of coming back to that Kabul withdrawal and the Afghanistan withdrawal, I'm just kind of curious, right? So we had previously talked to a C-17 pilot who helped with the airlift. And so he was from the air, right? Mm-hmm. Talking like on the ground, somebody on the ground that was in the Kabul airport. What was the immediate reaction after the bomb went off at the Abbey Gate? And how did that unfold?
So it was, I think, shock. In the back of our minds the entire time, we were always prepared for that eventuality, just because of the threat reporting. But I think for our unit especially, the first thing we thought is that this was just the beginning. It was going to be attacks, and we thought that maybe the airfield would try to overrun the airfield, not with civilian populations, but with like Taliban or whomever. So that was our first reaction. So the first thing we did when the bomb went off, besides scrambling crews to the helicopter, was collapse back to a compound that we had that was rescue only within the walls of Hamid Karzai. And we had PJs, air crew, we had support folks, AFE maintainers manning these like ECPs around a compound. And what I quickly realized, though, was we had zero guidance for how much lethal force to use, or even if we could use lethal force, because all we were told was, and all we told our guys really and our gals was like, man the ECPs without further detail, right? So does that mean that if somebody approaches that I shoot? Like what? That never came down the pipe. So a lot of folks were operating off of very little information, and we're just really just sitting there watching this happen. But that's the first thought that everybody had, was this is just the beginning. We're about to get overrun.
And so you talked about a little bit about like, okay, those intel reports were coming in, and like, what are the rules of engagement with lethal force and stuff like that? So do you attribute that to just like in the moment that's kind of expected, or do you contribute that to a lack of coordination and a failure to communicate properly in lieu of those intel reports?
Probably a little bit of both. It's really tough to, like, you can't think about every eventuality, and I'm very familiar with that. There's always going to be things that happen that you're not necessarily prepared for. Like ideally you are, but there's a lot of things that happen that you just have to use your training and your best judgment. When I would argue, though, just my personal opinion, that the vast majority of that, or the majority of that, lies with the lack of coordination and communication. What we ended up telling our folks was, bottom line, if you are in fear of your life, or like you get engaged, then you, in self-defense, you have to protect yourself and the folks around you. But it never got to that point. But it wasn't until like hours after that where we told our folks that. It took a while. So for hours, they were just unsure of what to do.
Yeah. And so kind of shifting gears a little bit, you've had a pretty interesting training career, mm-hmm. and you were able to go to the Rotary Wings Navy Weapons School.
Yep.
And so what was that like?
So, a lot of people call it Top Gun, but just for, the audience's kind of essay, the way that the Navy does it is Top Gun is for the Rhino folks, so the F-18 Echo Foxtrot community. That's Top Gun, I think what most people are familiar with. The rotary wing side on the Navy is called Seawolf. So that trains the 60 Sierra, 60 Romeo crews. And then there's Havoc, a couple other schools that the Navy runs, but it's all out of Fallon, Nevada. And that's where they train all their patches. The way I think of Navy Weapons School as compared to, like, let's say Air Force Weapons School, is Navy Weapons School is more of like a master's level of training, tactics training, whereas Air Force Weapons School is more PhD level. So what that looks like in practice is, for the Navy, you're looking at more like a broader level of mission sets, and where in the Air Force you go into a lot more detail into the weeds, and the Air Force's school is longer as well. The Navy trains more patches per year than we do because it's not as long, so on and so forth. But for me, it was very difficult because all those mission sets were brand new, right? I'm a rescue guy. I know gunnery. I know how to fly a helicopter. I know rescue really well. I have some direct action SOF experience just through deployments and some training. But the Navy does close air support. They do strike coordination and reconnaissance. They do maritime strike. They do all these different mission sets from the 60 that I'm unfamiliar with. They shoot Hellfire. They shoot 2 3/4-inch rockets, 20 mil cannons, all these things that I came into that community never having done. So for me, it was pretty difficult just because the mission set was different. Yes, the 60 Sierra as an aircraft is almost exactly the same as the 60 Golf, but the avionics are very different. So I luckily had great classmates that were going through the training with me, great instructors who took the time to teach me the mission sets that I wasn't as familiar with. But I think because CSAR is so dynamic, I'm able to think on my feet that made me able to like almost learn on the fly and through osmosis. But a rescue guy has no business shooting a Hellfire from a Sierra, right? And that's I actually failed a CAS ride because I shot without clearance, hey, lucky me. But I think, but kind of back to my previous point, as a rescue flight lead, it's your job to know everybody else's job. So by virtue of going through those mission sets and doing that, I understand CAS very well. I understand SCAR very well now. So I can use that knowledge in the rescue world. So I think largely it was hugely beneficial to my development as a rescue airman, and I loved that course and I loved that assignment.
And so when we talk about like the Air Force flying community, the naval aviation versus naval aviation, right? So like on a broad sense, like what are some lessons you learned from flying with the Navy that you brought back to the Air Force?
It's gonna sound maybe a little bit counterintuitive, or I learned more about officership from that experience than I did about flying, negotiations specifically. So one of the things I did for the Navy because one of their mission sets is CSAR too. So I was basically the Navy's CSAR SME on my exchange. So anything rescue or CSAR related, they would come to me and ask me about it. And I quickly realized that the Navy's tactics and their approach to CSAR was outdated. They were doing things very Navy-like, which meant like using older checklists, older procedures. And we in the Air Force had moved like maybe a year or two prior to that to more of a joint doctrine. So the same procedures across the board. So plug and play, whatever asset you want, everybody's going to do rescue the same way. So I spent a lot of time bringing that joint doctrine to the Navy, but I had to convince an entire community, hey, this is a better way of doing things. And just like in the Air Force, everybody wants to control the little fiefdom, because as soon as they give away some of that control, they're losing some of their power and authority. So I spent a lot of time rewriting pubs for the Navy related to CSAR. I spent a lot of time getting the community on one standard, because before my exchange, every squadron had a different standard way of flying, of tactics, things like that. So I spent a lot of my time with my Navy weapons school counterparts rewriting the standard way of executing in that community. Well, by doing that, I actually took power away from the Navy COs that were in charge of the squadrons, because they normally hold that authority. Like, no, this is the way my squadron does things. Well, I wanted to write a community-wide standard, which is how the Air Force does it. But in order to do that, I had to convince those COs that, hey, actually, all these goals that you have for a unit, by doing it, quote unquote, my way, I'm actually helping you achieve your goals. So I learned a lot about like communicating with senior leaders, right? They're 05s, but I was a captain. Trying to understand, hey, what is their goal? What's their intent for their units? And then communicating in a way that made them realize, yeah, actually this way is better for, but because I am the Air Force guy, right? Air Force guy in a Navy base. there was a little bit of animosity. It's like, what's this Air Force guy captain going to tell me that I don't already know? So I actually learned a lot about just officership and negotiation on that exchange as opposed to flying.
And so how do you prove that? Like, how do you prove that your operations in the Air Force are better than the Navy ones?
So I refrained from saying mine in the Air Force because that was a non-starter, right? The Air Force, Navy, especially on the helo or aviation side, that there's, not animosity, but there's a lot of competition there. So I'll give you an example, right? So one thing that I wanted to do by standardizing ops across the entire community is that I can plug and play a 60 from this unit, like let's say HH-60 and HH-60, and I could put those two 60s together and they can go execute a training mission. Two separate units. Before, with different standards, I couldn't really do that safely because HH-60 is going to do one thing, HH-60 is going to do another thing, and now there's a safety issue potentially. So what I basically told them was, hey, if you have a standardized way of doing whatever mission, doesn't really matter what it is, and both units know that, now if HH-60 only has one helicopter and HH-60 only has one helicopter, but they need two helicopters to execute this training mission for their syllabus, well, I can save you both time. I can put those two 60s together. You both get what you need accomplished without having to generate another aircraft, which generates maintenance, which blah, 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 right? So that's an example of how I did that. Your goal is to train pilots to achieve whatever. Well, I'm giving you a way to do that without having to spend more man hours or more money.
And so kind of looking towards the future of the Air Force and the Pavehawk, like what is in store for the Pavehawk going forward?
So the 60 Golf is going away. So the Pavehawk is being replaced by what we call the Jolly Green 2 or the 60 Whiskey. And pretty much almost all the active duty units have shifted over to the 60 Whiskey. My personal opinion, right, this is not attributable to the community, but my personal opinion is that the Chinook was a better replacement for the 60 Golf vice the 60 Whiskey. I mean, the 60 Whiskey is in almost always better, right? It's a newer platform, newer avionics, comm suite's all better, defensive systems are all better, flies a little bit faster, better range, so on and so forth, right? So better. But where I think the community and the aircraft need to go is much further range, much higher service ceiling, more room, more lift capability, more room on the aircraft to slap defensive systems on it to make it more survivable in a lot of combat theaters. But where I think the 60 community, or the rescue community, I should say, is going, I believe the 60 Whiskey is just a stopgap. Again, my own personal opinion. I think it's just a stopgap measure to replace an aging 60 Golf fleet, which we've frankly destroyed through GWAT. We've crashed a couple. They've taken quite a beating in those theaters. I just think it's a stopgap. So I think where the community is going is that tilt rotor, those advancements, right? So Osprey started to scratch the surface of that. The V280, the Valor. I think Bell makes it. Faster aircraft, better. It's still with the vertical lift and takeoff capability, more advanced defensive systems. That's where I think the community as a whole is going, just because it makes it survivable and more effective in all theaters. Currently, right now, the 60 Whiskey as designed, 98% of the threat areas where we would find ourselves is perfectly fine, right? It's that other area where we have no game in, right? But it's a perfectly fine, but people will always need rescuing, right? That's just the reality. There's always going to be missions to support, and the 60 Whiskey is perfectly capable in a lot of those theaters to do what it needs to do. I just think if you want it to be more effective, it needs to have longer legs, it needs to be faster, it needs to have more technology slapped onto it.
And so, considering looking at the future of conflict with a near-peer conflict with China, there's a really big emphasis on technology, especially stealth technology. Is there any changes that you kind of see coming to the CSAR/helicopter community?
There are changes. A lot of those are classified, right?
Naturally.
Yes. But in an unclassed environment, what I typically talk about is that, a 60 or any helicopter for that matter isn't really going to go feet dry in a China conflict. That's just not going to happen. But there's things that happen on the fringes of that conflict where the 60 is perfectly survivable. Ours, the Navy's, the Army's, whatever, that particular airframe can still do pickups in the water. And we train a lot to the maritime environment. We train a lot to, hey, how do we adjust our tactics to pick folks up out of the water versus in a forest or in a jungle or whatever. And we've been doing that for years. So our folks, and the 60 Whiskey with its advancements, like the flight director, so, it's a autopilot basically, right? The flight director that the 60 Whiskey has that the Gulf did not makes it a lot easier to fly over the open ocean, right? If anybody who's flown over the open ocean low in a 60 at night, no lights, poor visibility. I mean, it feels like you're in a ping pong ball, like in space, stars everywhere. It's very disorienting. So the flight director allows us to operate in those environments. But we have a lot of games still on the fringes of a conflict like that, where we can execute rescues, we can help support, and then there's other things that we're doing from a manning, positioning standpoint that are on the classified level that help us in that theater.
So talking like long term.
Okay.
Do you this is just came to my mind while you were talking about, where we're going. So like say the F-35B, right? Vertical takeoff and landing. Do you see a future where there's some sort of aircraft that is stealthy, fast, but more of a crewed aircraft that could land like in a combat search and rescue mission set?
I do. How far in advance, like how far in the future that is, I mean, I'll be a crusty civilian by that point, right? We probably all will, frankly speaking, but I actually think, again, my personal opinion, I actually think there's a lot that can be done with UAVs that will allow you to do rescue type of missions. I've seen videos and prototypes of where you have like a single little pod that's a UAV that takes off, flies low to the ground, goes to that individual that punched out. They get in the pod and then that UAV flies out. I've seen things like that. So I think in the future, what you'll see a lot more of with rescue is like a combined ops sort of thing. So yes, you'll still have some like vertical lift and takeoff capacity that exists, but you'll also have more work being done with UAVs. And the reality too is in our service, and when I say service, I mean like the DoD as a whole and our military service, we do rescues in a lot of different ways. I think people most often think of CSAR, but there's a lot of ways that we recover personnel. It's not just a 60 with PJs or crows in the back. We have a lot of different approaches to that mission set.
And so Air Force has a new helicopter coming on, the Gray Wolf. Mm-hmm. What can you talk about that? What's the capabilities going to look like?
I don't know a ton about the Gray Wolf. It's, better than the Huey because the Huey is ancient. But everything I've heard is that it doesn't quite, from the air crew's perspective, the folks that do the missile field mission, a lot of those air crew have said that it doesn't quite meet the requirement. It's not as fast, it doesn't have as much capability or lift capability as maybe they would want. I know they were looking at a 60 variant to replace the Huey, and that potentially would have been a better option. But again, just like the Whiskey, I mean, it's newer, it has a more advanced avionics, it's faster, so on and so forth, right? So there obviously is some increased capability there with having the Gray Wolf. As far as I'm tracking, there's like one right now at Malmstrom or Minot that was delivered. There's another one. So the Huey training pipeline is moving away from Kirtland. That's currently where we train our Huey pilots. And now it's going to be in Alabama. So the first one in Alabama has been delivered. So there are very few of them around. So I think it's too early to tell like the exact capability that aircraft brings.
Yeah. So that's awesome. So moving to your background in education, right? So you're an academy grad. So you came here as a cadet. What made you want to do that? And also when you came here on IA Day and stood on the footprints, did you know you wanted to be a helicopter pilot?
Not that early. So 9/11 was what brought me to USAFA, right? I was a freshman in high school. I think I was in school to take a test that I had missed, and I watched it in real time on the West Coast, in Southern California. And 9/11 is what was the genesis for me wanting to serve. I was initially going to enlist, not really sure which service, but that was like in my mind, my path. I had great advisors and mentors when I was in high school who said, I think a service academy is a better path for you. I didn't know about USAFA until my junior year. My high school volleyball teammate, he's a 2008 grad, he went first. I kind of learned about it through him, and then I applied. My parents didn't even know I was applying. They didn't know I applied until my acceptance package came into the mail. And my mom was like, "What's this?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, by the way, I'm gonna go to the Air Force Academy, right?" So that was a shock to them too. But that was, and USAFA is the only service academy that I applied to. Because initially I had like, I think being a pilot would be cool. And then I came here. And what I kind of tell people is that, like, you know, the upperclassmen were yelling at me, the MTIs are yelling at me or whatever. But in my back of my mind, I was thinking, well, nobody here is as mean as my mom, right? So this is like whatever, right? So it was all great. But I actually wanted to be a stow or a crow first, just to be kind of in the fight on the ground, that sort of mentality. And then I watched those guys like try to drown themselves in the pool, and I was like, nah. Not really my cup of tea, but I wanted to be in a career field where I was in the fight, quote unquote. So I learned about rescue and about helicopters, kind of about where you guys are at in your cadet careers. And I fell in love with the rescue mission set specifically, but I'm kind of a knuckle dragger a little bit. I like the low and slow vibe. I'm not as refined as our fixed wing brethren, let's say. So just everything about helicopters, everything about rescue spoke to me like at a very deep level. And then pretty much from three degree year on, all I wanted to do was be a rescue helicopter pilot. When I was in UPT, are you familiar with how like kind of the UPT like flight rooms look like? Right, so about a table longer than this that we had to shine every day, and they tested it by throwing a checklist on it, and if it slipped off the table, that means you did a good job. Anyway, so we were all...
I feel like there's a lot of variables there that you can't control.
Yeah, 100%, right? I mean, no doubt. And that's, I think, part of it. But so we had just got done scrubbing that table, and I accidentally left my my tobacco can, my dip can, and my knife on the table, and we're sitting at attention around this table. I'm like, oh, dang it, right? I'm just looking at the cans. Flight commander walks in. He looks at it, he picks it up, he's like, all right, who wants to be a helicopter pilot here? And I was like, I raised my hand, he's like, is this yours? I'm like, yes. So he gave it to me. But basically from day one, I wanted to be a rescue helicopter guy and just do, hard work, a little bit of luck and timing, it worked out.
That's awesome. I think the didn't tell your mom until you got the acceptance letter is that's classic. Not a classic, that's hilarious.
Yeah. And so you came here by way of Poland.
I did.
And so how did that happen? And have you had any unique experiences or challenges?
Yeah, so during the Clinton administration, well before y'all's time, he had a policy for the former Soviet bloc countries. You could basically enter into a lottery to get a green card. And the rule was you had to have family stateside to put you into that lottery. So my mom's uncle was in Jersey already, so he put my family into that lottery. We won green cards. And then we immigrated. My mom and dad had college friends who lived in Southern California, and they said, hey, you can stay with us for as long as you want. So we came to Southern California and we immigrated that way. I think it's maybe not unique, but we grew up with nothing, right? We came here, didn't speak the language. Both my parents had master's degrees that didn't count here because they were from a university in Poland. So I watched my family, my parents, scrape and work really hard to get like the bare minimum to provide a better life for us. So I got to watch that in real time, and I learned all about work ethic and what it took to succeed and all these things. And I owe like everything that I have now to their sacrifices and just their hard work. And I try to tell my parents as often as I can that, how grateful I am for that experience and being able to watch them do that. But one thing that I was able to do growing up was, so my dad's side of the family are all farmers. They still have a dairy farm in Poland. So every summer growing up, I would go to Poland and be a dairy farmer for the summer, basically, right? All the things that you would think about a farm kid, I was doing that. But also then during the year, like the school year, I would live in Southern California. So I always felt kind of out of place a little bit. Like I loved everything about being a dairy farmer, but I also lived in the city. So I always felt out of place in the city. But speaking of work ethic, like no harder workers than farmers. And I got to see that over the summer. And I also had to do that. I remember getting like kicked awake by my grandfather. It's like, it's time to milk the cows. It's like, dude, it's like 4 a.m. It's still dark out. And in summer, all my friends are going to water parks or doing whatever in Southern California. I'm like milking cows at 4 a.m. So, but looking back on it, that was obviously hugely developmental for me in my like young age. So.
And so you immigrated here with a green card. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but being an officer requires citizenship. So how was that process like when you get citizenship? And was there ever concern like, oh, I can't be an officer if I don't get this?
I quickly realized through the application process that I needed to be a citizen. My mom became a citizen when I was a little bit younger. So because I was under 18, it was just a matter of me signing paperwork, and I became naturalized. So I got citizenship that way. Never an issue, although I do remember, I think now you can have dual citizenship as a cadet, but back then you couldn't. And I remember being brought into like this little office as like a 4 degree by an OSI agent. They're like, you need to renounce your Polish citizenship. And I was like, okay, like how do I do that, right? So it's like a piece of paper that I signed. Like I renounced my Polish citizenship, and I signed it, and they, I think I had my Polish passport, and they shredded that in front of me. I'm like, dude, I'm good. Just like whatever you need me to sign, I'll sign. I'm here to be an officer. So it was pretty transparent, I think, to me. But I just recall those like instances. Pretty funny.
Cool. Yeah, that's crazy.
And so I'm a cadet in Squadron 6.
All right, for anyone who hasn't made the connection,
He is
his commander.
Yes,
so
Rage. And so what is one thing that you want the cadets in Bull 6 to take away from interacting with you?
Yeah, that's hopefully it's more than one thing, right? But if I had to choose one thing, I have in a lot of ways like a very romantic and idealistic view of officership. I do. I've always have. I think it's a privilege and honor to be a leader, to be in leadership positions, but to be an officer too. So I try to model that in my interactions. And, we talked a lot about, technology, stealth, all these things. I think we often look at our service, specifically the Air Force, and our capabilities, and we think it's because of our technology. I would argue that it's because of our enlisted force, right? Our enlisted force is some of the best in the entire DoD, and they do incredible things. I've seen them do incredible things, and they deserve leaders who will see that, will take care of them, will help develop them. What I like to impart on cadets, if I could, is that servant leadership, right? That you're not there for yourself. You're there to lead others, to help develop enlisted members, to take care of them, that sort of thing. So in my day-to-day interactions, in my modeling, I hope that that's what I can impart on cadets so that when they become officers, that's how they treat their enlisted force.
And so, what was it like? So obviously the AOC of Bull 6, what was it like transitioning from a very like special operations type career field, flying in the HH-60 to now being the commander of a cadet squadron of 18 to 22-year-olds and a little older at the academy?
Well, first of all, I graduated from 6, so coming back to 6, rage, obviously.
Rage.
That was weird because I distinctly recall, not that my AOCs were necessarily bad, but I distinctly remember avoiding that office, and it's the same office that I sit in now. So that was very weird, like right off the bat. But sometimes cadets will ask, like, hey, compared to like commanding an operational unit versus commanding cadet squadron, like what's the difference? It's harder, in my opinion, to lead a cadet squadron, not just because it's the 18 to 22-year-old year group, but it's because in a operational squadron, yes, I do have young folks there and older folks, but the reality is that even though they come from different walks of life, different backgrounds, things like that, different lived experiences, they all have generally the same goal, or at least I know what buttons to push to motivate folks like that. In a cadet squadron, I have 106 cadets, and they're all going to have different life goals, different career goals, and in addition to coming from different backgrounds, having different lived experiences, they also have vastly different goals for their careers and lives. So in order for me to effectively lead a cadet squadron, I have to get to know each individual cadet to help them on their own path. Whereas in an operational squadron, it's very easy for me to identify, like, hey, they want to just be great rescue airmen. I'll just motivate them in that way. So it's a lot more difficult to lead a cadet squadron.
And so I always see your family around squad.
Yep.
They're around all the time. So what is the key to that work-life balance in the military, and how do you balance being a dad with being a commander?
I generally dislike the term work-life balance, and I'll tell you why. Because I think that sets you up for failure a little bit, because the word balance, to me at least, makes it seem like it's going to be 50-50 or whatever, and it's going to stay consistently that way. That's not the reality of life. It's definitely not the reality of the military. There's always going to be some give and take. So for anybody who will listen to me, I always like to say it's work-life harmony. It's not balance. And what that looks like in practice is sometimes it's more work, sometimes it's more life, but as long as you're keeping it harmonized, and when you have to spend more time at work, you do. When you have some downtime to spend time with your family, you do that, right? But that requires everybody to be kind of proactive and look into the future and a little bit. It's like, okay, next week I have to gear up for this TDY, and I have to do a lot of flying. I have to do this mission planning stuff. So it's going to be longer days at work. But 2 weeks after that, it's downtime. So I'm going to take leave. I'm going to bring my family to work. I'm going to do whatever. So it's a give and take, and you have to find that harmony. So the way I find it is I make sure my family's involved in the squadron, right? I bring them to the squadron as often as I can. My wife teaches. She just taught top-off training for the firsties. And I have them involved in that way, and that helps me harmonize the two parts of my life, the work and the quote unquote life part of it. I think sometimes you'll see leaders too say, or commanders specifically say, I treat the people in my squadron as like my kids. I think that's a dangerous place to be, because if I were to treat the cadets in my squadron like my son, I have a lot of blind spots with my son, right? Because of my relationship with him, the way I love him. If I were to treat the cadets like my son, I'd probably let you all get away with more than you should. That's just the reality of it. But with that being said, there are a lot of similar skill sets, right? I want the best for my son. I want the best for the cadets in 6, right? I want my son to develop in the version of the type of person that he wants to be. And I want the same thing for cadets. So a lot of the skill sets are the same, for sure. And I think having, like, being a father, my son's 9.5, so having been a father for these past 9 years, I think a lot of the same skill sets that I use with my son, I also use with cadets, not because I think of them as my kids, but because the skill sets are similar. I like to think of the cadets in 6 as my younger siblings, because it's the same sort of relationship with my son, but I'm willing to hold them to a really high standard like I do with my younger siblings. I'm the oldest of 5. I will hold my siblings to a real high standard, and if they're, let's say, not meeting that standard, I'm willing to call them out. Whereas with my son, maybe I'm not as willing to do that, right? So, but I think there's a lot of similarities between being a father and being a squadron commander.
Yeah, awesome podcast so far. But we got one more question,
Okay.
traditional question here on the podcast. I don't want, well, it depends, or all the aircraft are great in the Air Force.
Okay.
What is the best aircraft in the Air Force's inventory today, and why?
The F-22. I'm just kidding. No, I don't. Have you ever had somebody who said something other than their own airframe?
Oh yeah, we've had people abandon their airframe.
That's absolutely not right. No, the HH-60, hands down. But here's why I say it, and I'm gonna cop out a little bit. Okay, it's not the airframe; it's the community, right? So what I always tell people is that I will do rescue regardless of what platform it's in, because of the mission and the community that go into that mission. So the reason why I think the 60 is the best platform in the inventory is because the people that are in the aircraft. And also too, what's unique about the 6, so the Air Force is all about multi-role. That's like the in term now is like, how many different things can you do, right? So the Viper has all these capabilities. They're trying to stuff everything they possibly can into the F-35. Everything is multi-role. The 60 is one of the few platforms that is purpose-built for a mission set, right? The A-10 is that way, but I would argue the A-10 has a huge role to play in CAS, also has a huge role to play in CSAR. The 60's role is only rescue. We do nothing else, right? So from just a unique perspective, or from the not a unique perspective, but a unique like position, the 60 is purpose built for rescue. We do nothing else. So, yeah.
Awesome. And thank you so much for having,
Of course,
for coming on. As a reminder, we have our episodes posted on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and we also have shorts on YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Rage.